Hello everyone and welcome to another MTG Top 10. I'm Nitsa, and each and every week I bring you a new MTG related Top 10 list. This week we're continuing something I've been doing on and off for a few months, looking at the best cards that possess certain keyword abilities. Last week, for example, we looked at Reach, and a few weeks back I did Indestructible, done a few others as well, but today we're looking at Hexproof, arguably one of the strongest keyword abilities in all of Magic. This ability makes it so that a permanent or player, in some cases, can't be targeted by spells or abilities, meaning that spot removal, the most kind of removal around, is useless against them. The only way to take down a hexproof creature outside of combat is with an edict or sacrifice effect or a board sweeper. As an ability, it has existed since early in Magic's history, but it was only given a keyword in 2012. Some of the cards on this list predate that, and while their errata says hexproof, you'll notice some of the cards on this list don't actually say it, but trust me, they do now according to Magic's rules. Hexproof is an ability that creatures who are particularly elusive or hostile towards Magic possess. While it has appeared on cards of all colors, these days it really only appears on green, blue, and white, with green getting it the most often, and all the cards on this list have at least one of those colors. Red and black, two colors that love targeting things and blowing them up, haven't had a monocolored card printed with the ability in a long time, which makes sense flavor-wise. Before we get into this week's MTG Top 10, let me give you a quick reminder on how I rank cards on these lists. Cards receive points depending on how many Grand Prix or Pro Tour Top 8s they've received, with a Pro Tour Top 8 worth twice as much as a Grand Prix Top 8. The cards in this list are then arranged numbers 10 through 1, with the highest score being found at number 1. I also count Legacy and Vintage Championship events as Pro Tour Top 8 so that those formats can be appropriately reflected in the scores of the cards. Now let's start with number 10. At number 10 we have Silumgar the Drifting Death, which came in at number 5 on a previous MTG Top 10 on Dragons. Part of a cycle of two-color legendary dragons and Khans of Tarkir, Silumgar put up the best resume of the cycle. This Silumgar is an ideal finisher for a control deck. It has evasion in the form of flying, and it has hexproof, making it very difficult to kill. What's more is, anytime any dragon attacks, Silumgar gives the defending player's creatures -1/-1. Even just swinging with one dragon, your Silumgar is often enough to make it so you either have other favorable attacks or kill a few creatures. And if you get a second dragon in play, well, your opponent is probably just going to lose. Silumgar existed in a format that had incredibly easy mana thanks to fetch lands and lands with 2 land types, and as a result, lots of different color combinations ran Silumgar, all of them control decks. This included dragon-heavy decks that played lots of spells that got more powerful if you had a dragon in your hand or in play, like Grixis, Esper, and Abzan dragons, but also decks with less of a dragon focus, like Esper control and blue-black control. Silumgar doesn't stand a huge chance of seeing play anywhere now that it has rotated out of standard, but does make an interesting dragon commander. At number 9, we have Invisible Stalker. This creature is even more difficult to deal with than most hexproof creatures. Most of them can at least be blocked and killed, but not the Stalker, because it's unblockable. The Stalker first showed up at Pro Tour Avacyn Restored in 2012, a block Pro Tour, where it picked up 2 top 8s in Bant aggro decks, which also happened to run a few auras that make creatures bigger, something that is a popular strategy in general with hexproof creatures, including our friend Invisible Stalker here, since it is so difficult to remove. In Standard, it went on to see play in blue-white Delver decks, which ran Runechanter's Pike, an equipment that gave a creature +1/+0 for each instant or sorcery in your graveyard, so you can see how the Stalker was appealing for the deck. While the Stalker still sees play in some versions of the popular modern deck Bogles, no version of the deck running the Stalker has ever managed a top 8, so it hasn't picked up a point since 2013. At number 8, we have Sigarda, Host of Herons, who did well enough to come in at number 6 on the Top 10 Angels video. Sigarda was a very pushed card, a 5-mana 5/5 flyer who had hexproof and also included an important line that spells and abilities your opponents control can't cause you to sacrifice permanents. This meant that the usual way to get around a hexproof creature, an edict effect, was useless against Sigarda. She could still be taken down by board sweeping effects, but that was it. At Pro Tour Avacyn Restored, a block Pro Tour, she picked up 2 top 8s as the top curve in 2 aggressive decks, Green-White Aggro and Naya Aggro. She also saw play in Standard, including in decks like Selesnya Aggro, Bant Control, Naya Midrange, and the aforementioned Bant Hexproof. Modern is where Sigarda has done the most work, though, appearing in Birthing Pod decks as the creature at the top of the chain of Birthing Pod sacrifices that could just end the game in the event the combo couldn't be assembled. You could also search her up at instant speed to stop a sacrifice effect. Birthing Pod was banned, but she has since managed to continue to see some play in the similarly constructed and themed Court of Calling decks, and has picked up a Grand Prix top 8 as recently as February of 2017, meaning Sigarda isn't quite done yet. At number 7, we have Dragonlord Ojutai, who managed a number 4 finish on my Top 10 Dragons video. Dragonlord Ojutai does not always have hexproof, but he has it as long as he is untapped, meaning that sorcery speed removal isn't great against him. Ojutai balances out the fact that it loses hexproof when it's tapped by having a ridiculous combat damage to a player trigger that allows you to look at the top 3 cards of your library and pick a card. In Standard, it was the card that won a lot of games for Esper Dragons decks, but it also appeared in decks without the Dragon theme because it was so good, like Bant Megamorph and Jeskai. The Dragonlord is a great win condition in a control deck because you can play him and use him to block since your opponent just can't outright kill it the turn it comes into play, thanks to Hexproof, and it makes sure you draw more threats or ways to protect yourself, or it, once you get in for combat damage. It hasn't seen much play outside of Standard, although Yuya Watanabe did manage to come in 10th at 2015 World Championships running Ojutai in his blue-white control deck, so who knows, maybe it will find a top 8 in Modern at some point. At number 6, we have the only card in this list that is never a creature, and that is Leyline of Sanctity. Instead of granting Hexproof to a creature, it gives you Hexproof. This means you can't be targeted by your opponent's burn spells, discard spells, and, well, any spell that targets you. Like all Leylines, it can also come into play for free at the beginning of the game. This is especially devastating against burn decks, and the Leyline has seen a lot of play in sideboards across multiple formats because of how well it combats them. In Standard, it only saw a little bit of play, showing up in some Cobblade and blue-white control sideboards, but it has really taken off in non-rotating formats like Modern and Legacy, where burn is one of the top-tier decks, so the Leyline is particularly powerful. It has seen play in a variety of decks in Modern because it is such a great sideboard card. This includes decks like Scapeshift, Ad Nauseam, Abzan, Bloom Titan, and more recently Lantern control decks. In Legacy, it has seen play out of Hivemind, Sneak and Show, and Miracle sideboards. It even sees a bit of play in Vintage, putting up a top 8 from the sideboard of a Mud deck at the 2014 Vintage Championships. So far in 2017, it has already added 5 points to its score, so I don't think it's slowing down anytime soon. At number 5, we have Lumbering Falls from the Creature Land cycle in Battle for Zendikar blocks. These cards are all good, both cycles of them in the 2 separate Zendikar blocks. They are lands that produce 2 colors that can turn into win conditions in the later part of the game. They dodge all sorcery speed removal, and that's a big deal. Lumbering Falls also happens to dodge, well, basically all removal, unless it is an instant speed edict effect. This makes it an especially good land for grinding out a win after a board sweeper. While it is no Celestial Colonnade, Lumbering Falls has seen a fair amount of play. So far, all of it has been in Standard, but I think we could see this land making it in Modern too. In Standard, it has seen play in the majority of decks that have both blue and green in them. In its early time in Standard, this was in decks like Bant Aggro, Bant Companies, and Sultai Emerge, and more recently, it was seeing play in Aetherworks Marvel decks, but with the Marvel banned, it's not going to see much more play in those decks, but it'll still have a home most likely in Standard. At number 4, we have another super pushed creature. Turns out putting Hexproof on creatures is a good way to push them. Geist of St. Traft, who has made an appearance before in MTG Top 10, coming in at number 2 on Top 10 Clerics. Geist is a crazy card. For 3 mana, you get a 2-2 with Hexproof that makes an angel with 4/4 flying every time he attacks. In some games, this effectively makes Geist a 3 mana 6/6. Geist first saw play in Block Constructed, showing up in 3 Pro Tour Top 8s at Pro Tour Avacyn Restored in 2012, 2 in Bant Aggro, and 1 in a Miracles deck. In Standard, he was such a key card that some decks were named for him, in particular the Saint White Weenie decks, which were blue-white aggro decks that basically only had blue in them for Geist. He also saw play in blue-white Delver decks alongside Invisible Stalker in some versions. Like the Stalker, Geist was one of the creatures with Hexproof that gave the Bant Hexproof deck their name. Geist with auras on him is just stupid, and that's what those decks wanted to do. Geist didn't only see play in Standard either. He has seen a fair amount of it in Modern as well. He picked up top 8s in Delver and Cobblade decks primarily in Modern, but he hasn't managed to pick up a Modern top 8 since 2015. Still, I wouldn't count him out just yet. At number 3, we have Thrun, the Last Troll. Most creatures with Hexproof give control decks nightmares. Thrun, the Last Troll adds to that by not being able to be countered either, and by being able to regenerate, so this troll is pretty difficult to deal with. Most board-sweeping destroy effects just can't kill him. Only board-sweeping exile or -X effects, as well as edict effects, can take him down if his controller has the mana to regenerate him. Thrun's hardiness has led to him seeing a lot of play, as his 4/4 body, regeneration, ability to not be countered, and a Hexproof all combine to make one of the more difficult to deal with creatures in the game. He first saw play at Pro Tour Nagoya in 2011, a block Pro Tour, in a 4-color control deck. Thrun also saw a lot of play in Standard, and this included both mainboard and sideboard play. He showed up in the mainboards of a variety of decks. These included aggro decks like Green-White Aggro and Green-Red Aggro, but also included Temur Control, Kessig Titan, and Birthing Pod. If he wasn't in the mainboard of a deck with green in it, he was probably in the sideboard. This included decks like Valakut Ramp, Vengevine, and Mono Green Aggro. Thrun also sees play in Modern, showing up in the mainboard of Jund and Birthing Pod, and in the sideboard of Zoo decks. He's even found his way into some Legacy decks, primarily the various incarnations of Maverick, though he hasn't seen play there since 2014. He hasn't seen play in any format since 2016. In Modern, one of the decks that played him the most got banned in 2014, Birthing Pod, and he has stopped seeing play in Jund decks right now because control decks aren't as prevalent in Modern as they once were. Though you can bet if there is a resurgence of control decks in the metagame, Thrun will find his way back into top 8s. At number 2, we have Fleecemane Lion. A 2-mana 3/3 is already a great rate, but it also comes with Monstrosity, which puts a +1/+1 counter on it, but more importantly, gives it Hexproof and Indestructible. Those two words together make the Lion one of the hardest creatures to kill in all of Magic, along with Thrun. Only sacrifice effects and board sweeping effects of -4/-4 or greater can take it down. The Lion was great because you could just play a huge creature for 2, and in the later part of the game, it became an even bigger problem for the opponent. Fleecemane Lion first saw play in Theros Block Constructed at Pro Tour Journey into Nyx, which incidentally was the last Block Constructed Pro Tour. He got top 8s in a Constellation deck and a Junk deck, which was basically just a good stuff deck. He saw a ton of play in Standard too, though. In the beginning of its time in Standard, it was in all manner of aggro decks that happened to be running green-white as the best 2-drop in the deck. This included Naya aggro and Selesnya aggro primarily. And after the printing of Siege Rhino and Anafenza, Fleecemane Lion was a nice fit for Abzan decks too. So unlike some cards that end up losing ground when the metagame changes with the printing of a new set, Fleecemane Lion just kept on rolling. The Lion has never seen play outside of Block or Standard, and I think it's unlikely that it ever will, so it will probably be surpassed by cards that are still seeing play in non-rotating formats like Geist or Thrun in the near future. And at number 1, we have Sylvan Caryatid, who also did well enough to come in at number 4 on my top 10 0-power creatures list. Mana Dorks are always powerful in Standard, and this one is a pretty good one. It can't be killed by 1-mana removal spells like most of them can. In fact, it can't be killed by most removal spells thanks to Hexproof. It can also block reasonably well in the early game while fixing your mana and ramping you. It was one of the best cards in Theros Block, as evidenced by the fact that it put up 7 top 8s at Pro Tour Journey into Nyx, a Block Pro Tour. It saw a ton of play in Standard too. Again, ramping into your 4-drop on turn 3 is no joke. In its early days in Standard, it saw play in a wide variety of decks. Aggro decks wanted to play their 4-drops early, and control decks wanted to play their sweepers and win conditions as quickly as possible and have access to as many colors as possible. So it saw play in Gruul aggro, Jund aggro, and 4-color control. Once Khans of Tarkir came out, Sylvan Caryatid could allow you to play a Siege Rhino on turn 3, something it did, unfortunately, a lot of in Abzan decks. It also saw play in Devotion to Green and its various incarnations. It hasn't seen much play since rotating out of Standard, but it does have one Grand Prix top 8 in a Jeskai Ascendancy deck back in 2014 in Modern, and it doesn't seem completely far-fetched that it could see play in the future in Modern. Though, it has to compete with creatures like Birds of Paradise and Noble Hierarch for a slot in decks that want mana creatures, and those two cards are probably just going to be better. That does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit the like button. Let me know your favorite creature with Hexproof in the comments, and if you want to make sure you catch all future episodes of MTG Top 10, don't forget to subscribe. My content is also sponsored by 5colorcombo.com, a great website for all things Magic, and you can use my discount code NEEDSAHONE5 for a 5% discount in their store. Thanks for watching.